Hello, everyone. My name is Nnamdi Anozie of Anozie LLP. This year, I have the distinct honor and privilege as serving as a co-chair along with Leslie Shigaris of the DBA, Dallas Bar Association's Public Forum and Media Relations Committee. I'm very excited to introduce to you our Faith Leaders Forum, which is an event started by this committee under the leadership of Rob Crain, who is no stranger himself to the Dallas Bar Association. He is a nationally renowned personal injury attorney and a founding partner of Crain, Brogdon, Rogers LLP. And he is well known as a passionate leader both in and out of the courtroom. As evidence of that, to date, he has obtained some of the largest personal injury verdicts and settlements in the nation. But beyond that, in the community, Rob is also an advocate in several different forums, including for-profit community, and a co-founder along with Pastor Butler of Together We Dine. And a recently launched program launched as of last month, Together We Can, which promotes the message of the reality that there is more that unites us than divides us. With that, I will allow Rob to come on as the moderator of this wonderful program, introduce our panelists, and get going. Thank you all for attending, and we appreciate your continued support of the Dallas Bar Association and our events.
Nnamdi, thank you so much. Welcome to everybody. We hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving, a safe Thanksgiving. We're so blessed today to have these wonderful leaders with us to really, quite frankly, show us their great example. Many of y'all know this is somewhat of a repeat of what we did back in November of 2017. We had these great leaders all in the same group. Pastor Carty is unable to be with us today, unfortunately. He is under the weather, nothing serious, but we're going to miss him today, and our thoughts and prayers are with him. But as I was talking with some of these great leaders beforehand, one of the great things that we saw in 2017 was really just the example of so many of our faith leaders in North Texas crossing lines of thought, crossing lines of beliefs and ideas, and just showing love and support for one another, despite what differences we might have in any belief system we may have. And that is so critical for not just our communities here, but our country as a whole. We're obviously divided politically, as our election has shown us. We don't need to hide behind that fact. But as Pastor Butler often says in our work together, what unites us is much greater than what divides us. And the example that we see from these gentlemen and the women leaders that we've been talking about as well in our community is just phenomenal. And it really shows us not just what we can do in regards to race and faith, but really any type of differences of philosophy or perspectives or ideas that we may have. And so I'm so grateful for these leaders being with us today and talking about some really important issues. And it's important as lawyers. Lawyers have been a leading group of professionals in North Texas and in the country since our city's founding, since our country's founding. And we are attorneys and counselors. And sometimes we forget about our counselors part. And this is really, an opportunity for us today to take some of the skills and examples from these individuals and be able to apply those with our clients, as well as with our community groups and so forth, as to how we can help, facilitate better understanding and support for one another, even though we may not agree on everything. So with that, I'll start with my partner in crime, Pastor Richie Butler, with our introductions here. Pastor Butler was raised in East Austin. He affectionately said it was the hood back in the day. He was a stellar athlete and earned scholarship to SMU, where he graduated, then went on to Harvard Divinity School. Did some extended studies in urban planning at MIT, but what you're also going to understand is that this is a brilliant group, collection of leaders as well. And until recently, he was bivocational. Real estate was his passion. Saw real estate as a vision for a lot of solving a lot of our problems that we've created and the divisions that we've created and segregation, not only in schools, but in real estate as well. He was the senior managing director at the Prescott Realty Group. He's responsible for $500 million of urban real estate development across the country. He founded Union Cathedral Church on his own. And then in 1994, with the leadership of Bishop McKee and many of the leaders in the United Methodist Church locally, merged Union Cathedral with St. Paul United Methodist Church, historic church in the Arts District in downtown Dallas. Just recently named senior pastor at St. Luke Community United Methodist Church. And for all of you familiar with St. Luke, what a powerhouse of a church it is, and what a merging of great leadership and membership there at St. Luke. So excited about what's going to be happening with Pastor Butler in the leadership. He is the founder of Project Unity, 1994, following all the events throughout our country in Ferguson and so forth. And with that, he'll tell us more about the particular events that he's created. Together We Ball, Together We Learn, Together We Dine, which was also partnered with the Dallas Bar Association that kicked off in 2017. Together We Can, which just launched this last month. We'll visit a little more about those projects. I do want to also mention Together We Test. These gentlemen as well are not just looking at faith issues, they're looking at economic issues, they're looking at education issues, they're looking at health issues and breaking down those systemic divisions that we've had in our community. And Together We Test has brought the ability to test into areas of our city during this pandemic that was not available. He was our 2017 Dallas Bar MLK Justice Award recipient, married to Nisha Strambler Butler and their wonderful children. Imam Omar Suleiman, with all of our leaders here, we could go on for days on their introductions. He is a world-renowned scholar, and I don't put that into hyperbole. He is a world-renowned scholar and theologically driven activist for human rights. Just Google him. Founder and president of Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research, adjunct professor of Islamic Studies at Southern Methodist University. He's the resident scholar of the Valley Ranch Islamic Center, co-chair emeritus of Faith Forward Dallas, as many of y'all know, multi-faith coalition of clergy for peace and justice, Rabbi Stern's better half, Dr. Nancy Kasten, Rabbi Nancy Kasten, also a partner with Omar, Imam Omar in that venture as well. Imam Omar, recognized by CNN as one of 25 Muslim American change makers, included in the Muslim 500, the most influential Muslims by the Royal Islamic Strategic Studies Center, native of New Orleans. And we're going to hopefully hear a little bit more about his time in New Orleans, his work with the East Jefferson Interfaith Clergy Association, and the work following Hurricane Katrina, which was so important and life-changing for so many people. As with all these gentlemen, he was a leader following tragedy. He was at the peaceful protests on 7/7/2016, when those 5 police officers lost their lives protecting the peaceful protesters, and then was asked to lead the invocation at that memorial service with President Obama, Vice President Biden, and former President George Bush. And worked, like I mentioned, with leaders across religious lines, not only Rabbi Kasten, but also Pastor Andy Stoker, Dr. Michael Waters, and many others. Rabbi David Stern, senior rabbi of Temple Emmanuel, the largest synagogue in the southwestern United States, attended Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion at its Jerusalem campus, New York campus, Los Angeles campus, receiving his MA in Jewish education. He also high honors in English from Dartmouth College, magna cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa, studied at Harvard Divinity, immediate past president of the Central Conference of American Rabbis. This is a big deal. 3 generations of his family hold that office, and that's a big office. Serves on the Board of Governors and the President's Rabbinic Council of Hebrew Union College, a Jewish Institute of Religion. He's a staunch social justice advocate on local, national, and international issues, on the advisory board of the Bud Center at SMU. His poetry has been published in the Central Conference of American Rabbis publication. And as I mentioned, married to Rabbi Nancy Kasten, which, by the way, their announcement of their marriage was in the New York Times the day after they got married in an article, not just some paid for little publication. It was a big deal, which I learned today. And I didn't realize this, Rabbi Kasten's a cradle robber. But that's for another discussion. Dr. Jeff Warren grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, went to East Carolina University. Was there a football game this past weekend that we need to talk about?
Keep moving. Just keep moving.
I played real football, by the way. I didn't play the American football.
So East Carolina and SMU may have had a tussle this past Saturday, but we won't talk about how that finished up. Received his master's degree in theology and doctorate of ministry from Southwestern Theological Seminary. His work focused on Christian apologetics. Named one of the SWBT's best preachers, recognized for his doctoral project. After seminary, became the minister to students at Park Cities Baptist Church, and then became the minister to young married folks. Really developed a lot of the foundation for Park Cities Baptist Church before then moving on to become senior pastor at FBC McKinney, where the church has boomed and explosive growth. And then he came full circle back to Park Cities Baptist Church, where he is the senior pastor and has been since 2010. His passion is to unite the church across racial, economic, cultural lines in order to see the gospel movement in this city in our time. He describes his God-given mission as one who has been called to preach the gospel to the church that we might rescue one another from cultural Christianity to follow Jesus every day. He and Pastor Brian Carter have been an unbelievable team in our community, developing multi-platform projects, not just pastor swap, kid swaps, and bringing their two churches, one predominantly white, one predominantly black, together and doing things that we all need to be doing and coming together. And looking forward to hearing more about that today. He's married to Stacy, and they have three children, twin daughters, Whitney and Emily, and son Travis. I know I went on a bit here, but I want everyone to appreciate the leadership that we have here and how important it is to our community. But with that, I want to briefly go around, and I'm just going to go around my Zoom platform here, and so that puts you up first, Pastor Warren, and just briefly tell us, give us a flavor as to your family and your experience growing up that led you to your calling as a pastor here in Dallas.
Well, first, thank you, Rob, for having us here. I'm humbled to be with these other leaders, and so grateful for the great faith leaders that we have here in Dallas. And this is such an important topic. So I hope everybody will hang with us, stay with us. So I grew up in Charlotte, mostly in the 60s, 70s, where it was kind of post-segregation still. I remember fights breaking out in my middle school and other places when I was growing up. I was bussed a few times as they were trying to figure out how to put kids where in schools. I remember that as a kid. I went to 4th Ward Elementary School downtown. We lived in the burbs. And kind of my first, getting to know people of color. And, I lived in a white neighborhood, right? But I was raised with committed, really godly parents who taught, I found out this was maybe unusual later on, that taught that all people are created in the image of God. And I'm grateful for that foundation. There wasn't this kind of racism that so many grow up with, I think, biased and such. So I didn't have a lot of that growing up. I'm grateful. So on Strength Finders, I'm empathy is my highest trait, and just again, God-given trait. I can't understand, so I feel all the feels, and that can lead to all kinds of trouble and angst and challenges. But I can't figure out why people don't have more empathy for people who are struggling and people who maybe don't look like them and people who need encouragement and help. So that's part of why I became a pastor, I'm sure, now that I've figured all this out in terms of my personality and how God wired me. But the long story short, I gave my life to Christ when I was young, in a Christian home, again, a great church and all that. And then really sensed a real calling from God while I was in college, and to give my life to ministry. And then over time, the Lord would call me here to a global city like Dallas, with a real passion for social justice and racial reconciliation. You know, people tell me, Jeff, why don't you just stick to the gospel, as if there's an implications-free gospel that has no implication on our lives otherwise. And it just, you don't find that in scripture. So by his design, humor, and all the above, he planted me right here. And I'm grateful to be here in Dallas. I love this city, love the people, love all that's happening in our city. We've got a long way to go, but we're all together in this, and I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. Pastor Rabbi Stern, you're heavy on rabbis and lawyers in your family. Tell us about your upbringing.
Yeah, it is pretty much all rabbis and lawyers. I grew up in Scarsdale, New York, a suburb about 20 miles north of New York City. Similar to what Pastor Warren described, I think my high school class of 450 kids had about 6 kids of color, maybe. And so my direct contact with folks of color did not come until later in my life. My contact with an emphasis on social justice came sort of with mother's milk. My parents were both highly committed social justice advocates. My father from the pulpit, my mother from the pew. They would have organizing meetings in our living room, which I now recommend to all sorts of people. Like, don't let your good works happen at the office or at the church when somebody isn't looking, but do them in the living room where the kids have to troop through with their backpacks and say, what are all these people doing in my living room? And you can say, oh, these people are here because we're talking about low-income housing. Like, I think the idea of, I learned from my parents that the importance of bringing that stuff to the living room, to the kitchen table, to just about every conversation. So that's where that part of me came from, and through my father's preaching, especially with an emphasis on the prophetic message of justice, exactly as Jeff says, like, show me some scripture that doesn't speak to my day, and I'll show you either something that may not be scripture or certainly scripture that I'm not interested in. So I think that that also was just part of the both cultural, religious, institutional, home, educational context across the board. So that that's always been part of who I am. I'm so grateful to God and to God working through my family for helping shape me in that direction. My mother, who was also a rabbi's kid, her father was a rabbi, desperately wanted me to do something else, or at least not to do this reflexively. So she was the one who kept saying, are you sure? Are you sure? Are you sure? And when I said yes enough times, she sort of shrugged and said, okay, well then. So that's what brought me to the rabbinate. And then it was a wonderful opportunity here at Temple Emmanuel that brought me here 30 plus years ago. Nancy and I say that we moved to Dallas for 5 years, 30 years ago. So here we are, and we're thrilled to be in the city. I'm thrilled to be part of the vital work that is ongoing, sometimes hopeful, sometimes discouraging, but always present. And I'm honored to be in it with all the folks on this call.
Thank you. Imam Omar, talk to us about your upbringing in New Orleans.
Yeah, so I was born in New Orleans, right in the center of New Orleans. I grew up in New Orleans and then also Baton Rouge. My parents were both Palestinian refugees. I managed to settle in as a Creole in New Orleans. And, you know, one of the things that was wonderful about my upbringing was that I had a multi-faith background, and that, you know, in my mother's family, there were plenty of Christians and Muslims. And we had an opportunity to really explore that depth in the family. So it wasn't just making family out of people of different faiths growing up. They actually were part of our family. We had that in our family, and that wasn't foreign to us at all. But I would say that you know, one of the things that distinguished both of my parents was that their deep commitment to humanitarianism. And I know that seems to be a recurring theme, that we are all the fruits of our parents. My parents were awfully dedicated. You know, my father was, he actually just retired and moved to Dallas right before COVID. But was a professor at Southern University, a distinguished professor of chemistry at Southern University, one of the most prominent chemistry professors in the world. and chose to be at a historically Black college because he wanted to invest in a university like Southern University over the likes of LSU and others. Built one of the largest laboratories in the country there. Was also dedicated as a religious leader and as a scholar of so many different disciplines. And my mother was a poet, and she was used to write poetry about the oppressed peoples of the world. And what I grew up with was this idea of coming home and finding refugees that are going to live with us for the next 3-4 months, not from the same place that they came from. So with Bosnia, for example, I'll never forget coming home and finding Bosnian refugees in the house that don't speak a word of English, and they're going to live with us for 3 months. Dad not picking me up from school because he donated the car to Somali refugees. So I got to find a way home that day. That was stuff that was very common growing up, and never distant from the issues in the streets, never distant from the homelessness that was right down the street. I think what was very impactful with me personally, or what made me so inclined to faith, was that I grew up witnessing Klan rallies. I was actually, abused by the Klan as a teenager. And at the same time as seeing that racial injustice, and I've shared this with David many times, that Rabbi David Stern, that my father threw David Duke out of our mosque when I was a kid. When I grew up later on, he would become once again relevant in 2008 in New Orleans once again, and I had my own confrontation with David Duke. So it was obviously the confronting the circumstances around us and living that reality, but it was also, frankly, my mother's illness. My mother struggled with cancer my whole life. She struggled with multiple strokes. The fourth stroke, which ultimately took her life in 2007. And that led to some deep, the circumstances on the outside of our home and the circumstances on the inside of their home led to some deep questioning at a very young age. I was forced to be an adult by 10, right? So I had to figure it all out. And that brought me to a deeply spiritual place first, and then to a deeply committed place to Islam. And then I just say that after Hurricane Katrina, you mentioned this, and I'm sure I'll touch on this a little bit later. Our faith communities in New Orleans came together after Hurricane Katrina like no other. I mean, we had to be a family because we were all homeless. We had to build each other's places of worship and then see worship in rebuilding each other's places of worship. Serving our community meant serving our New Orleans community. And so I think we built a transformative relationship, one that I was worried that I would not be able to replicate here in Dallas. But then I found that here in Dallas, by the grace of God, people were placed in my life here, faith leaders that I consider absolutely family to me. And a lot of that is because of tragedy, and tragedy has a way of pulling us together. And I pray that we can maintain those relationships throughout tragedy. So here we are, together we Zoom. I'll also mention that my one sibling is a lawyer, and he looks just like me. He's 4 years older than me, but 4 inches shorter than me, and he doesn't have a beard. Well, he has a COVID beard right now running, but if you figure it out, his last name is Suleiman, and he's here in Las Colinas. He's my one brother. So we're all here in Dallas now.
Good to look him up. Pastor Butler.
My story probably a little different in that I grew up in a single family household. My mother and I had one sibling, and we grew up, in the hood. East Austin, today's East Austin is not the East Austin that I grew up in. I remember when I went back to Austin probably 15 years ago to my home church, and went to visit. They were doing some renovations at the church, and there was a white lady around 10 o'clock riding her bicycle, and we realized the neighborhood has changed. When I was growing up in East Austin, that would not have occurred. Not that East Austin was unsafe, but it just wasn't that place. And part of that reality, in terms of when I go on, the west side of 35, if you all know, Austin is divided east and west by 35, and the east side is where African Americans, Latinos, low income, everyone resided. And then on the west side, downtown in the hill country, everyone else who had resources now is very different. But sort of living that reality is what helped to prompt me to think about ministry. I grew up in the church, so I was one of those kids. I grew up Baptist, probably like Jeff. So we had Sunday school at 9 a.m., Baptist Training Union at 10 a.m., morning worship at 11, which lasted at least 2 to 3 hours. And then we had 3 o'clock service and then an evening service. And my brother and I were the only kids left, and we weren't the pastor's kids. So I did, but church was a very integral part of my life, but had no intentions of being a pastor or being in ministry, but definitely felt a calling of sorts to address social justice issues. And for me, one of those resonating issues was around economics, because I still believe that is probably one of the great bastions. Ironically, King didn't get assassinated up until he decided to take on economic issues, not necessarily civil rights. And also biblically, they didn't decide to try Jesus until he ran the money changers out the temple. So mess with folk money, you have a fight on your hands. And so part of my calling was not just to ultimately, preach. And I told God, if let me do business very well, I'll finance your kingdom. And God said, no, I'm calling you to build it. And so, but I did feel a calling to focus on real estate, because I thought about how do I go back to East Austin and transform my neighborhood when I got to SMU, and realized and concluded that real estate developers do that. I mean, they take buildings, they take they take a piece of dirt, and they create something. And also biblically felt like I had permission because Abraham was the first real estate developer. So felt that responsibility. And then God tugged me and said, I want you to do that, but I also want you to lead my people as a pastor. And so moved in that direction. And so here we are today.
Well, I know with you and our close work together, I mean, everybody on this panel could make all the dollars you all want to make doing things with all of your skill sets and so forth. And yet all of you have dedicated your lives to others. And we're so fortunate for that. So I'll stick with you, Pastor Butler. So Project Unity, give everybody a quick snapshot of what it is, but I'd like for you to tell us, why. What is Project Unity attempting to do, and let folks know about the various components of it.
Yeah. First of all, let me say this as relates to Project Unity. I cannot ignore this notion or tug in my spirit around the word unity, and I'll give you some context. As has been mentioned, in real estate, my first real estate development deal was named Unity Estates in 1998. And that was the African American Pastors Coalition here in Dallas. Brian Carter is now the president. Zan Holmes, who was the pastor of St. Luke, I replaced him, was the president of the coalition. So that was my first real estate development deal, Unity Estates. The church I started in 2002 was Union Cathedral, merged that with St. Paul United Methodist Church in 2014. And a month after we merged the two churches is when we hosted a town hall meeting at the church in response to what was going on in Ferguson. So I had the DA, the chief of police, and the sheriff at our church. But one of the things I noted in the space was every negative energy, the hate, anger, mistrust, fear, anxiety, everything was just boiling. And out of that moment is the vision for Project Unity. So this notion of unity and recognizing that unity is not singing Kumbaya, but it really is digging deep and speaking to the issues. And I sort of put it this way, I think we're all on a continuum. And part of my desire is to meet people where they are on this continuum. And hopefully if you're at a 0, fine. but I want to meet you at that 0 and let's move to a 1, 2 and keep progressing, because I want to create more allies and fewer adversaries in the space. But part of Project Unity's birthing was to focus on bridging divides and leveraging what brings us together. And honestly, as a faith leader, and I think my colleagues can speak to this, unfortunately, religion, has not been a uniter. It has been a great divider, and still to this day. And some of that is that we don't even want to, acknowledge the role that religion has played in the oppression of people, and continues because of its silence and ignoring, its past. I mean, it was slave. I mean, the religious leaders, helped to prop up and justify slavery. I mean, and biblically, use it. And to this day, it has never been unpacked and honestly dealt with. And so through Project Unity, I mean, we want to bring people together, but we want to also, address the issues of justice and equality and equity. And I think by doing that, we can bring about what I believe God intended for unity to look like. And it's not the haves and the have-nots. It's all God's people recognizing each other's humanity in Acts, where it talked about the church, the early church, gave to each other and literally took out of their own pockets to make sure that their brother and sister was taken care of.
And you bring up so many great points, and I've watched you. And number one, I want to say Project Unity is multi-faith, multicultural. It is an open door, everybody, anybody, as the projects we're talking about today. But when you talk about meeting people where they are, and that's so critical right now, because we're not all at a 5, we're not all at a 3, we're not all at an 8, and being able to approach somebody who may be screaming literally, bigoted, racist type messaging, that's still somebody that you are going to approach. And I've seen you do it with a positive approach and try to have some communication, just as you would with somebody that has very parallel, similar views as yours. And that's not easy to do, but watching you do that in such a positive way with folks, it is something that we've all kind of sort of got to start getting our heads around and be able to grasp that skill set.
Yeah. I just try to model Jesus, and Jesus was Jewish. He wasn't trying to start a new religion. I just want to be clear on that. I don't think so. So I'm just trying to model Jesus. I mean, I think he met people where they are, and I think loved. And at the end, think about it. He challenged when he was being challenged around, what is the greatest law? What's most important? He said to love God and to love your brother, your sister. And just think about that. I don't care what your religion is, or if you don't even have a religion, if we could master that, I'm done.
Imam Omar, your work, it's so broad, but I want to talk a little bit about your work with Rabbi Kasten and Pastor Stoker. Islamophobia over the past, forever, but just watching you work in areas where you just walking out and putting something on video like you did with Pastor Stoker, that's not a safe thing for you or your family. And going out and vice versa as well. You've written about how you've gone and met I believe it was a Baptist pastor at lunch, and they were kind of hiding in the back room because they didn't want to make sure nobody saw him with you because he was worried about what that might do to his congregation. And
let me be clear, that wasn't Jeff Warren.
Might have been.
He has no problem being around me in public.
But the work that you do, I want you to talk about it, but I do want to just comment, to the audience, there's a different element to what you do. It is not always a safe thing. And, I know you don't let that get into your brain and how you act, but there's a different component to the outreach that you do.
Well, so yes, I do think that one of the things that we fail to recognize often is that the work that we're able to do here is not work that can be done in most parts of the world. And so our ability to come together and to actually build relationships are so foreign to other parts of the world that it threatens some of the polarization that then gives weight to the political movements and violence that exist around the world. And by the way, that's also true here, that polarization can force us out of fear into our echo chambers. And I think that often the political implications of our coming together are more threatening than the religious implications, right? And so, I mean, in the very beginning, when we started this program, when we spoke about our willingness to sit with one another despite our religious beliefs, I would think that what's more remarkable these days is our willingness to sit with one another despite our political beliefs, because politics has become far more polarizing, even though politics often, our political differences often mask themselves as religious differences. And the idea is that we're willing to see each other's humanity through those differences, period. That we're willing to see our same humanity through those religious or political differences, period. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, when we come together, and because I have the element of an international sort of viewership, in the sense of when I do something here in Dallas or in New Orleans, it's going to be viewed internationally and sometimes will undercut some of the narratives that exist internationally, then that becomes threatening to certain groups. And so, yes, I definitely didn't anticipate that the video that Andy and I would do would elicit the response that it did from ISIS. I knew it would threaten some folks, but it did. But I will say this, that despite the reaction that it got from a group like ISIS, and despite the reaction that our togetherness gets from extremist groups here in Dallas, right? I'm thinking about the armed white supremacists that prior to COVID would keep showing up in front of our mosques for years. I think they were just as threatened by our coming together as this foreign terrorist group. Because at the end of the day, we deflate political narratives that are based on this narrative of the impossible togetherness that we display. And it's so genuine that it comes across in our discussions with one another. Our interfaith dialogues and multi-faith movements here are not merely coming together to give a few statements. We're forming the beloved community, and we're showing the world what's possible. And so I'm excited about that, and I'm not in any way deterred by the hatred that I've received here or abroad, right, for that work. If anything, it just shows me that it's that much more important. And I mean, when we talk about our heroes, it is one thing to talk about their speeches, another thing to talk about their sacrifices. My personal hero, Hajj Malika Shabazz Malcolm X, was assassinated at 39 years old, just like Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated at 39 years old. I definitely don't wish for that, but I am committed to this work, even if it was to cost me my life. And I don't say that lightly, but I am very much so committed to this work. And I am grateful that people like Nancy, like Andy, like Michael, like David, like Jeff and Richie have been willing to step into this work with me. And I pray that we always stay together and never let fear drive us apart, either the fear of one another or the fear of what we stand for, or the fear of what our togetherness will threaten. I pray that it never allows us to be divided.
So powerful. I want to follow up on something, Imam Omar, that you referenced back in 2017. And I think it's really important at this moment. You indicated that the importance of coming together in times of quiet to form genuine bonds is just as important, if not more so, than in the immediate aftermath of events. And I want to put it into the context of George Floyd's murder. So much passion, so much action in those many months following his murder. And I'm not diminishing what is still ongoing now, but as a middle-aged white man, I can feel it. I can sense it in the community, larger community, that it's, we're kind of back in a little bit to that lull that seems to happen in between these major events. And I'd like you to flesh out for us what you meant by, in that times of quiet, building the relationships, and how the importance of that is.
It's, every press conference that I've been to in the aftermath of a tragedy, there has been a commitment when we've seen one another to meet sometime afterwards. That almost never materializes. But some of us have chosen to continue to build relationships outside of the tragic moments. Why? Because we don't want our relationships to be transactional. We don't want them to be dependent upon the moment or conditional upon tragedy. And I'll say this, that I think that the incoming Biden administration, which I hope it's okay for me to say, I'm very happy that we don't have a second Trump term, but it poses its own unique challenges, because a lot of us could really go back into a sense of complacency. The Trump presidency, for what it's worth, brought a lot of our communities together, brought a lot of our faith leaders together. It unfortunately, there was a wave of Islamophobic, anti-Semitic violence, racial violence across the country. That's not new, but certainly escalated, and the character of the country deteriorated. But our coalitions became stronger. We cried on each other's shoulders, right? And that's the thing, when you cry on someone's shoulder, that's a very powerful moment. And so I fear complacency at times. I really do fear complacency. I fear that people get comfortable and say, well, now we can all relax and wait for the next wave to happen, though quiet is good. Forming real relationships allows us to not just move beyond the moment, but allows us to see our own blind spots. A lot of times a person might condemn violence and not realize that they are the purveyors of the policies that allow that violence to happen. And it might be completely unknowingly. So you got to move beyond the George Floyd moment, and you need to ask yourself, from my place of privilege, am I a part of the problem, in that I'm not even understanding the policies that led to the circumstances of George Floyd's life prior to his murder, the over-policing of the neighborhood that George Floyd was in at the time that he was killed, the apathy of much of America to what was witnessed there. We all have blind spots. We all have blind spots. And you don't build real relationships unless you're willing to have difficult conversations. And some of the closest people in the world to me are the people that I've had the most difficult conversations with. Mm-hmm. If you're not willing to challenge each other, if you're not willing to be vulnerable with one another, then we can smile in front of the cameras for every press conference, but the causes of violence that continue to yield the necessity of those press conferences will not go away unless we have a transformative relationship with one another, where we've already displayed that vulnerability with one another, challenged one another, shown each other blind spots, and then emanated that spirit of togetherness that can show the possibilities to not just America, but to the whole world of what it looks like to build relationships. So I pray that we are able to maintain our relationships. It's COVID, by the way, and I'll say this, that it makes it that much more challenging. COVID also allows us to retract back to our own congregations and just focus on our own. We're not having some of those conversations in cafes or restaurants that we were having before, or in each other's living rooms that we were having before. And that's a challenge as well. So it's important for all of us to really just push through that complacency, even with the isolation, the social isolation of COVID, and keep reaching out to one another through phone calls, through having meaningful check-ins with each other throughout whatever this season will give to us.
Rabbi Stern, Mom Omar hit on a lot of the themes that I recall you talking about, and that is, the coalition building, proximity, and breaking down assumptions. and tell us about those thoughts that you have in your social justice work.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think I'll also pick, I mean, there are a couple, Omar said a lot of things that are really important to me personally. I think the risk of I actually think the risk of complacency, ironically enough, set in before Election Day, because I think we all vested everything in which lever we were going to pull and decided that that day was going to be the great decider of the fate of the nation, which in many ways it was. But I mean, every day has to be Election Day. Like every day I have a choice of what I'm going to elect, right? Am I going to elect compassion today? Am I going to elect engagement today? Am I going to elect participating in one of Richie's projects today? Am I going to elect making sure I'm staying in touch with Omar today? Like I have to elect every single day. And there's a weird passivity that happens with a national voting day, right? Is that we're like activist, and then the Tuesday comes and we all sit back and wait for somebody to tell us what the count is and what the fate of the nation is. And I just think we've just got to keep electing. So I could not agree more, Rob, with both your question with Omar's answer about the risk of complacency. I think on the question of coalition building, I do agree 1,000%. This is about the building of relationships day in and day out. And it is about the history of relationships and cultivating those relationships. It is not exactly as both Richie and Omar have said, not relationships as sort of salve and anesthetic and making sure we're not talking about hard things, because then those really aren't relationships, right? By definition, the relationship is the space that makes room for the hard conversation. So I really agree with that. I think the way I feel differently about this than I did 3 years ago, and this is probably stealing some of Jeff's thunder, but he's been a teacher to me on this. Our congregational efforts these days are actually more inwardly directed than outwardly directed. They're about addressing racism within our synagogue community, period, not period. Semicolon, right? But they're about addressing racism within our synagogue community. We now have I think it's called Within and Beyond Our Walls is the name of our anti-racism task force. And for Reform Jews who are so used to being on the ramparts of this as if it were somebody else's problem, right? That we're going to be noble and support them in, right? This is now about, no, this is our problem, right? And I'm not going to ask Richie to come tell me what it feels like to be a Black person. I'm going to ask the members of my own community who are Jews of color what it feels like to be a Jew of color in my community. How often does someone assume that they're on the maintenance staff? How often does someone assume that they're a vendor? How often does someone tell them something that any Jew would already know because they don't think they're Jewish? And so for us now, the big difference between now and 3 years ago is 3 years ago, we were, good old fashioned progressives on the ramparts, which we still are, thank God, and still thank God in coalition with the people on this call. But we are more and more saying this work is internal. Now, part of that is an internal dynamic within the Jewish community over the last 3 or 4 years. Demographers estimate that somewhere between 10 and 18% of the Jewish community consists of Jews of color. Jew of color could mean an African-American. Jew of color could mean a Syrian immigrant to the United States, right, who's Jewish. I mean, it could mean a whole lot of different things. But the presumed white Eastern European profile that we all imagine a Jew looks like is simply not what Jews look like writ large. And so a lot of this is about our own awareness of the racial diversity within our community, which again, I know the church has been at for a lot longer than we have been. But I think especially now, there's a certain, I don't want to call it lazy because it takes a lot of work, but there's a certain reflexive comfort in taking this on as a cause. And I know, Rob, you're interested in the question of allyship. Jeff has said this, others have said it. The bottom line is that racism is a white problem. And it's going to be addressed by white leaders and solved by white people figuring out what it means to have this fear of difference hardwired into it and how we can work with it. The real question is not, can I be an ally to Richie, right? The question is, will Richie be willing to be an ally to me as I work with this within my white community to address the racism that is fundamentally a white problem whose consequences are borne by people of color?
Well, Pastor Warren, Rabbi.
Sorry, Jeff. I know that's your sermon, but you've taught me, man.
Oh, that's powerful. That's
Yeah.
powerful.
Well, and let's just lead in. I mean, you brought up Dr. King many times in his letter from Birmingham jail, and what he said is so powerful. And I'll let you roll with it, Pastor Warren, because you know where to go with this.
Well, there's so much, so much. And what Omar said, incredible. Just love these guys. And I hope, again, the participants are just listening, saying, how can I make a difference where I am? I'm guessing that most of us, probably majority white watching this. I'm just going to guess. None of us white people want to hear, you know what? You're a racist. None of us really want to hear that. And yet that's what I've learned through my own personal journey and my seeking to understand the problem of racism in America. It really is a white problem, and no white person wants to hear that. It is, those who are in power are the ones who are going to have those biases. It's why we talk about white fragility and fear. That, that's what I think we've sensed over the past 4 years, 8 years, 10 years. As we watch our nation become more and more diverse, there's a fear among white people that we've got to reckon with. That, hey, what's happening to my country, as if it's our country, right? So then now you're even stating it's a white country. So I think it's important for us to remember. Yeah, Dr. King, who impacted my life in so many big ways. When he read when he wrote a letter from Birmingham jail, a lot of people don't know he wrote it to white clergy. And he said, you guys are claiming that you're in, and thanks. And y'all are, saying or maybe preaching some of this stuff that justice matters, but you're not really getting in the fray. You're desiring what he called a false peace. That is what we've alluded to today. It's not entering into the hard conversations, recognizing from people of color, learning what it is to grow up Black in America, to be a Muslim in America, to be Jewish in America. I'm sitting here, Rob, with you. I'm the white guy. I could argue I'm the white, right, middle-aged guy among these others who understand what oppression is. I don't understand that until I enter into conversation with my brothers. And that's where these friends and Pastor Carter, close friends, have meant so much to me, where I can go directly to them. I had a conversation this morning. A guy on my staff, I said, hey, I've never asked you this. What is it like to be Asian on our staff? I mean, do you get any pushback? Is it weird to be Asian? We're predominantly white. And I'm grateful he said, no, I don't really think about it, but that's probably an Asian thing, right? But I say that because Dr. King was calling out white leaders, and I would say every white person listening to me right now is a white leader of influence who is in a field of justice making. And difference making. You can be a difference maker right where you are as an attorney. And he's calling out white leaders to say, you're the ones that will make the difference. And that's really what I've learned. And I'm just grateful. Rabbi Stern alluded to this. I'm grateful for people like Richie, Butler, my African-American friends who are just in the conversation. I mean, I know that many just like, whatever, I've been at this all my life. And I'm tired, and I've grown tired and weary, even as white man in the mix. But I'm just grateful for the Black brothers and sisters who will stay in the conversation, who could have given up long ago, because it is a marathon. It is not a sprint. And I think it's important for us in Dallas in particular to learn our history. Nobody likes to go back to the dark days of lynchings in 1910 when Alan Brooks was lynched at Main and Akron in downtown Dallas. I've talked about, the KKK. One of every 3 white eligible men were a part of the KKK in the 1920s into the 30s. You can Google a great article. I say great, sad, difficult article to read out of Dallas Morning News when Dallas was known as arguably the most racist city in America. Ku Klux Klan Day at the State Fair of Texas, 1924, I think it was. Largest attended day at the State Fair, 150,000 people there on a weekday. Big initiation of, I think, 50,000 new Klansmen that night in the Cotton Bowl. I mean, this is our city we're talking about. And we can say, well, John, we're not there anymore. That's not who we are. Why do we keep going back to that? Because it's in our DNA. You know, you think about 100 years ago when that kind of thing was happening, the lynching of Alan Brooks, with thousands of white people, by the way, taking what would be, you can see pictures, what would be the equivalent of taking selfies with a man hanging from the Elks Arch that says, "Welcome to Dallas." That's our city. Now I say that, that's not our city, praise be to God, anymore, but that is in our DNA. We've got to reckon with that, and we need to repent of that. And I'm talking to myself, I'm talking to white people who've got to say, we've been wrong, and we've got to turn this thing around. And it's on our shoulders, and now's our time. So I just challenge all of our listeners to join me and us for seeking to make a difference. And the great thing is, what I realize, and I think every one of us, regardless of our faith tradition, when you step into this space, the grace of God shows up. I mean, it is powerful. Sometimes you know, in our leadership, we're praying for God to move and do a great thing and bring revival to our people. But when you step into this space, though hard it is, and it's difficult and it's challenging to be a white pastor in the mix. But this is where we're often saying it's hard to keep up with God. It's hard to, now we're chasing after him to see what he is about in the city. So everybody can do their part. You know, that's what I would say. Everybody.
And that was powerful. It may have been a D magazine. It's either D magazine or Dallas News, but in a powerful article. And before I go back around the room to kind of get your message to our listeners about what they can do going forward and building these coalitions and going in a positive direction. I want to step over to Mom Omar and talk about kind of, you know, the segue from what Pastor Warren's just talking about and community growth, city growth, individual growth. And look, I mean, you're a young man, Imam Omar, a lot younger than I am, and you have gone through the test of fire at a young age. Your work in New Orleans, I mean, you were in your 20s and, you know, dealing with national issues, and you didn't use always the right words, I should say. And you've talked about it in your own editorial in Dallas Morning News about your personal growth through all this. And that's something we all need to have, you know, grace with ourselves as well, as we're like, okay, we do have this past, I do have this DNA, but the ability for growth is there.
Yeah, I think, look, when you're, I'll be very frank, a Muslim leader has zero margin for error throughout their entire lives. The scrutiny that a Muslim leader goes through in a climate of Islamophobia is far different, because the goal is to, I think, to eliminate any type of meaningful Muslim presence from any space. However, the importance of being self-critical and really welcoming growth. I know for a fact through my relationships with pastors and rabbis and everyone that we've had the ability to build that type of relationship with. You know, people look back and they wish they would have said certain things differently and grown differently. Now, I don't say that as a deflection. What I do want to say, though, is that growth is a hallmark of the heroes that we laud today. The Dr. King of 1965 is not the same Dr. King that was assassinated in 1968. The Malcolm X of 1965 was not the same as the Malcolm of 1963. And so we have to be willing to grow and to be sincere enough with ourselves to grow, to listen to people about how we express our viewpoints, how we stay committed to our principles without using words that are hurtful. And I think that I'm grateful for the call-ins. I'm grateful for the relationships that allow us to be true allies. Look, like I said, we all have our blind spots, and we're not going to figure out those blind spots unless we have people to help us see them. And if we're sincere with ourselves, and if we're really trying to be a force for faith, and goodness and positivity in the world around us, then we have to be willing to take those phone calls. We have to be willing to listen with our hearts and to consider that growth. If I am the same person at the age of 50 that I was at the age of 40, then I failed. And so I think that that's something that we all have to challenge ourselves with. And I'm certainly grateful for the faith leaders that have helped me over the years. And I hope that I've been able to be a presence for others as well and help others see some of their own blind spots. And I pray that it'll help us get through.
It's wonderful. Well, let me give each of you an opportunity, and I'm already over because I don't manage time well, especially when there's so much great substance you guys are providing for so many. But if you've got a message in this day and time about taking those steps forward and building these coalitions and making our community a stronger place, and accepting and supporting and loving those who have different ideas, thoughts, beliefs. What is that? And Pastor Warren, I'll start with you and go back around our room for a final lap.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. Just some real practical things. We all have places to go, websites and groups and such. To point to, we've recently launched a thing called One Dallas Movement. You can go there, onedallasmovement.org. There's actually an anti-racism pledge that you can sign. This was a citywide effort that took place this summer. So if you are a church-going person, you can bug your pastor, to join in. And we have a Dallas clergy. We meet every Wednesday at 11 and pray together. People can reach out to me, Pastor Carter, and I have enjoyed that time together with pastors across the city. So our hope has been, ever since Ferguson really took place, we said, what if Ferguson came to Dallas? Little did we know that something like it would come not too long after that. But we said, we don't really know each other if it were to come here. So this is why this is so important. I would say it starts with the relationships. Reach out to somebody who doesn't look like you and just have lunch. Just get to know each other. That's a starting point. I think reading, what I've learned is even just learning, just growing and understanding is a step forward. We talked about meeting people where they are. So getting a book, there's great books out there that can help you understand more. I saw in the chat, some of us, what do you do with white people? Don't even think there is a thing called racism still that exists. I would say, talk to a person of color and ask them what it's like to be a person of color in Dallas, Texas right now. And what's your past. I think it's important that we learn each other's stories and then we discover that we're a lot more, all of us create an image of God, have a lot more in common than we do that separates us. So I would say that just learn more about our history that got us to where we are, and let's not repeat it. And let's all be intentional. Everybody do their part. And I would say too, parents, you've got a critical role. You have a key role. When I think about being born in, the 60s, late 60s, about 100 years before the Emancipation, after the Emancipation Proclamation, I can, when that hit me, I thought, okay, that was like 2 generations ago. If one generation misses this, no wonder we are where we are. We're not far from it, unless as parents, as leaders, we speak to the next generation. So Gen Z is the most diverse generation in America. And I think we can applaud them. I think we can learn from them. And let's raise them up to be one.
Thank you. Rabbi Stern?
I just share 3 quick things. First, just so happens that Jewish lectionary cycle, we read Genesis 32 this week, Jacob wrestling with the angel. And certainly in Jewish interpretive tradition, one of the understandings of that angel is that Jacob is wrestling with his own conscience. And I think that the idea we have to wrestle, and then he goes on to embrace Esau. I think the idea that we have to wrestle with ourselves before we can embrace the other is more true today than ever. We have to wrestle with self in order to embrace the other. Related to that, number 2, I too am hopeful about the new direction the country is taking. I am hopeful it will be a time of healing. And as anyone who has ever rehabbed from orthopedic surgery knows, healing can hurt. So we should not think that healing means anesthetic. I believe profoundly that it will be a time of healing, And I have never seen any real healing that doesn't involve some amount of pain. So we shouldn't say that as soon as it hurts that, oh, you see, that healing thing is a crock. No, healing sometimes hurts.
Mm.
The last thing I would say, and this is because it's the wonderful Dallas Bar Association, and I forget if I said this last time. One of the things that I think has eroded in this country due to polarization is the dignity of a good argument. And this goes back to what Richie was saying about unity not being kumbaya, and what Omar was saying about friendship being the space for conflict. I think that especially as attorneys, you all know better than anyone else that arguing doesn't have to be toxic. And I would say you know better than anyone else how to have a good argument. I am hoping that this time of healing for our country is not a time in which arguments are over. I think it's a time in which hopefully productive arguments can begin again. And I think as attorneys, you guys have the skill sets to help us all come back to a space of a really good arguing.
Thank you.
Imam Omar?
I don't want to spoil a great ending. I think that was a wonderful way for us to leave with some instruction. So thank you, Rabbi David, for those 3 points. I would just say that it's important for us to complicate our worldviews as much as possible. When everything is so polarized, then it's easy to just reduce ourselves to very simplistic worldviews and to be reductionist both of other people's arguments and of other people as a whole, which allows us to vilify everyone with whom we disagree and to put them in a box. I think that, what David just said about a good argument, a decent argument, I really love that. And I think that that's the best thing that we can take from this all. If we're going to be allies to one another, we have to hear one another, and we have to hear with our hearts. And we have to be willing to challenge ourselves and to be challenged by our own for the willingness to engage at a deeper level and to grow. And we have to really, to be able to take these relationships and to find ways to bring them back to our communities and to make sure that we're not just building relationships as clergy, but leaving our communities out of this. So I pray that that this relationship that we've built amongst each other, I hope that it's able to continue to flourish and to grow. And I do mean that genuinely. And from the heart, and I do hope that everyone here as well is able to take some perspective back and think about how they can implement some of this in their own lives and challenge their own selves. It's funny, I just posted something yesterday, I believe, about one of the Prophet Muhammad's sayings, peace be upon him, about your neighbor going to bed hungry. I was thinking, how many people have even gotten to know their immediate neighbors, right? Just checking up on your immediate neighbors right now. So sometimes we're missing out on the very simple instructions of our faith that would help us develop perspective as we move into the greater values that our faiths call us to.
Thank you. Pastor Butler?
All I can say is amen. I mean, and it has truly been an honor and privilege to be part of this panelist with these great men of God. I'll just say this, and this is a plug, a shameless plug, but I think it's an important plug, and that is Together We Can as an option for people to engage. We launched it, soft launch back in August. It was in response to the question that as a Black man, I got from all of my white friends and colleagues after George Floyd's murder. What can I do? And so Together We Can is in response to that. And it's three simple things. One is symbols are important. That's why we've had a hard time getting rid of Confederate symbols, monuments. And so a simple bracelet is a symbol, and it says that I am, says 3 things. One, I want to be part of the solution around anti-racism in this society. It says it's an accountability piece. I'm holding myself accountable and holding each other accountable by simply wearing a bracelet. I know it doesn't seem like a big deal, but it does say it sends a message. The second thing we're asking people to do is engage in dialogue and conversation and participate in a Together We Dine. And that begins relationships when we sit down and think about it. Food is one of those things that bring people together. And so leveraging that piece. And then probably the most critical piece and the third piece is this notion of 1 hour per month. And that is we know racism is a cancer on our society, but this 1 hour per month becomes part of that chemotherapy session. And we're faith leaders. We expect our congregants to show up to, whether it's the mosque, the synagogue, the temple, the church, once a week. And now virtually, we anticipate that. And if we're serious about changing the trajectory around racism and becoming anti-racist, then we're encouraging people to commit to this 1 hour per month because it becomes a lifestyle. It's not just showing up for a panel and watching us talk about this thing, but engaging hardcore. And we're providing activities, forms of engagement each month for you to literally be educated, to be introspective, be reflective. For example, the month of November was focused on the Declaration of Independence and a whole set of exercises and articles and listening exercises that actually just raised the question: who was the Declaration of Independence really intended for when it says all men are created equal? And for us to ponder that and reflect. So every month. So I want to challenge us to really think about that whole notion of developing what we call a lifestyle of anti-racism. And if you want that, then togetherwecan.one is the website. I'm sorry, Rob, I had to throw that in.
It's good.
No, it's great stuff. And the paradox of the Declaration of Independence, as Dr. King said, it's the magnificent words of the Declaration of Independence, but it's a promissory note that all men and women are part of that promise and that idea of America. And that's our journey, that we strive toward that great idea that all of us are created equal. But to all of you, thank you. I cannot thank you all enough. You're such an inspiration to me personally, and I know you are to so many, because they've been clamoring to have you all back ever since we did this back in November of 2017. And to all of our participants out there, thank you for joining us. We have the recording of this. We'll have it posted at the Dallas Bar website, and you're welcome to share freely and liberally. These examples of these fine faith leaders, and there's so many others in our community, we cannot spread this far and wide enough, the message they bring to all of us. So all of you, please stay out there, stay safe, be well, and we'll let you know about our next opportunities coming soon.